Have you ever been left out, overlooked, or made to feel like you didn't belong? Today we're talking about what it means to not just pull up a chair, but to create a space where everyone feels seen, valued, and included. If you've ever wondered if there's a place for you, or how you can be that person for someone else, this episode's for you. Let's talk about finding and offering a seat at the table. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt out of place? Maybe it was a new school, a new job, and even a family gathering where everyone seemed to have their own inside jokes, their own rhythm, and you were just there. You try to smile, act like you belong, but deep down you're wondering, do I really have a place here? Do I matter? That feeling of being on the outside looking in, it's not unique to you or me. It's something many of us face in different forms throughout our lives. For some, it's about race or ethnicity. For others, it's about age, social status, gender, or even past mistakes. There's this unspoken reality that we live in a world that loves to draw lines between those who belong and those who don't, who's worthy and or who's not worthy, who gets a seat at the table and who's left standing on the sidelines. But here's the thing about those lines. They're human-made, not God-made. And if you look at the life and teachings of Jesus, you'll see that he spent a lot of his time breaking those lines down. Jesus didn't just create spaces where people felt welcome, he created spaces where people knew they belonged. Now, I know belonging can sound like a buzzword, but I want to take a moment to unpack it. Belonging isn't just about being invited, it's about being embraced. It's about knowing that your voice matters, your presence is valued, and your story has a place. Belonging is the opposite of exclusion. It's the antidote to loneliness. And if there's one thing I've learned from scripture and from life, it's that God's heart is for belonging. His kingdom is about inviting everyone to the table, no matter who they are or where they come from. I want you to think about this for a second. What would it feel like to walk into a room, a space, or even a relationship and know without a doubt that you belong there? No doubts, no second guessing, no whispers in your head saying, you're just not good enough. Just pure, unshakable belonging. For many of us, that's a rare feeling. It's especially rare for those who've been told explicitly or implicitly that they don't measure up. And that's where the heart of this episode lies. Today we're talking about what it means to have a seat at the table. Not just any table, but God's table, the one he's prepared for all of us, where no one is excluded, no one is overlooked, and no one is less than. This episode is particularly relevant as we honor Black History Month, because Black history is filled with stories of people fighting for their rightful seat at the table. From the civil rights activists who challenged segregation laws to everyday heroes who broke barriers in education, business, and culture, their persistence reminds us of the power of claiming the place God has prepared for you, even when the world tries to deny it. Think about the courage it takes to say, I belong here, in a world that often says otherwise. Think about the faith it takes to believe that you have a purpose, a voice, and a role in God's story when everything around you seems designed to keep you out. We're not just talking about the big societal tables like politics, education, or the workplace. We're also talking about the smaller, everyday tables we encounter in our lives. The lunch tables at school, the meeting tables at work, the dinner tables at home, the metaphorical tables where decisions are made, where relationships are built, where community is formed. In your own life, have you ever felt excluded from a table? Maybe it was a group of friends who made you feel like an outsider. Maybe it was a situation where you felt judged for who you are, where you come from, or what you believe. Or maybe it's not even about being excluded by others. Maybe it's about excluding yourself. Maybe you've believed the lie that you're not good enough, not talented enough, not worthy enough to take your seat. Here's the thing. God's table is different. At God's table, there are no VIP sections, no exclusive invites, no waiting lists. There's a seat for you just as you are, and not just a seat in the back corner or at the edge, a seat of honor, a seat that says, you are loved, you are valued, you are mine. And let's just be clear here. This isn't just about individual belonging. It's also about who we invite to our tables. Because if we're following Jesus, then our tables should reflect this. They should be places of radical inclusion where people from all walks of life are welcome. They should be places where the overlooked are seen, the marginalized are valued, and the excluded are embraced. Today we're going to dive into a story from the Bible that beautifully captures this. It's a story about Jesus sitting at a table with people who didn't belong by society's standards, and how he turned that table into a place of grace, love, and belonging. As we explore this story, I want you to ask yourself, what tables are you sitting at and who's missing from them? Because here's the thing about God's kingdom. It's not just about having a seat at the table. It's about making sure there's room for everyone else too. You know, Jesus had this incredible way of shaking things up. He didn't just tweak the rules, he flipped the whole game. And that's exactly what's happening in Luke chapter 14, where he takes something as ordinary as a dinner party and turns it into a life lesson on what his kingdom is about. Here's the setup. In Jesus' day, banquets were basically the Instagram of their time. They were about status and showing off. The guest list wasn't random. It was curated to impress. You invited people who made you look good, who could repay you with invitations to their equally impressive banquets. It was a whole system of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The poor, the disabled, and the outcasts, they weren't even on the radar. So when Jesus starts talking about who you should invite to your banquet, it's like a record scratch moment. In Luke chapter 14, verses 12 to 14, he says, "Then he turned to his host. When you put on a luncheon or a banquet," he said, "don't invite your friends, brothers, relatives, and rich neighbors, for they will invite you back, and that will be your only reward. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you." Let that sink in for a sec. Jesus is saying, forget your social norms, forget your carefully curated guest list, invite the people nobody thinks about, include the ones who can't pay you back. This wasn't just countercultural, it was revolutionary. Banquets weren't just meals, they were statements of power and privilege. Who you ate with said everything about your social standing. And Jesus, as he often did, took that system and tore it down. He told his followers to stop worrying about impressing others and start focusing on who needed to feel seen, valued, and loved. And here's the thing, this isn't just about who we invite to dinner. It's about how we live our lives. It's about who we notice, who we include, and who we're willing to make space for. We might not throw banquets in the same way, but we still have our own social circles. We have those invisible lines that determine who's in and who's out. And whether we realize it or not, we often draw those lines based on what we feel comfortable or what feels familiar. But Jesus didn't come to make us comfortable. He came to challenge us. He came to show us what love really looks like. And love doesn't draw lines, it builds bridges. This is where Black History Month gives us an insightful lens to look through. Think about the civil rights movement for a second. What were those sit-ins at lunch counters about? They weren't just about food. They were about inclusion, about claiming a seat at the table where decisions were made, where community happened, where people were seen and heard. Jesus was calling for that same kind of radical inclusion long before the movements we know today. He was saying, in my kingdom, there's no such thing as an outsider. Everyone gets a seat at the table. Now, let's be real. This kind of inclusion isn't easy, it's messy. It means stepping out of our comfort zones. It means inviting people into our lives who might not look, think, or act like us. It means doing things without expecting anything in return. But isn't that what Jesus did for us? He didn't wait for us to get our act together before he invited us in. He didn't say, prove you're worthy and then I'll love you. No, he saw us at our worst and loved us anyway. And now he's calling us to do the same for others. Here's the question. Who are you inviting in your life? Are you making room for the people who make you feel comfortable, who think like you, who fit neatly into your world? Or are you willing to expand your circle, to create space for those who might never be able to pay you back, but who desperately need to know they matter? I'll tell you this, it's not always convenient. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. When we choose to include others, we're not just reflecting God's love, we're living it out in real time. And here's the beautiful part. When we live in this way, it doesn't just change the lives of the people we include, it changes us. It opens our hearts, broadens our perspective, and brings us closer to the heart of Jesus. So today, let's take a hard look at our own circles. Let's ask ourselves, who have I been overlooking? Who needs to know they're invited? And what would it look like to offer them a seat at the table? Jesus didn't say this to make us feel guilty. He said it to set us free. Free from the need to impress, free from the fear of stepping out, free to love the way He loves. And that's a freedom worth living for. History has a way of teaching us lessons that go deeper than any textbook. And when it comes to the topic of inclusion, Black history provides a powerful lens through which we can see both the pain of exclusion and the triumph of inclusivity. And we'll get right into that after this short break.
Hello, good to see you today here at the Lenses of Love set. I love to watch Sam's message and learn from him how to see God and His Word through the lenses of love. Perhaps you would like to learn more about other questions of life. For example, why am I here? Is there a God? Why is there so much evil and suffering? And why are there so many different religions? And which one is true? Is the Bible fact or fiction? Who is Jesus of Nazareth? Was He truly God as Christians say He is? Why did Jesus come to earth to die? And how does His death offer us salvation? What happens when I die? Is there really a heaven or a hell? These questions and others we answer on our online Bible study platform at hopestudy.ca. There, you will find answers to these and other crucial life questions. We would love to hear from you. Please email us at hopestudy@hopetv.ca. And remember, there is hope and answers to life's biggest questions in the Word of God.
Let's start with the hard truth. There was a time in not so distant history when being excluded wasn't just a personal experience, it was a law. Segregation wasn't accidental, it was intentional. Jim Crow laws in the United States mandated separation based on race. There were separate schools, water fountains, restaurants, and even church pews. Black individuals were systematically told, "You're not welcome here." Think about that for a moment. Being turned away not because of anything you've done, but simply because of who you are. Segregation wasn't just about keeping people apart physically, it was about dehumanizing them, about saying you don't belong. And it wasn't just in schools or public spaces, even churches. The very places meant to reflect the love and inclusivity of Christ were segregated. Imagine walking into a church, a house of worship, only to be told, this seat isn't for you, this altar isn't for you, this God isn't for you. That's the kind of exclusion many people lived through every single day. But exclusion wasn't the end of the story, because while there was oppression, there was also resistance. While there were barriers, there were also bridge builders. Take, for example, the case of Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, this landmark decision declared that segregated schools were extremely unequal and unconstitutional. It was a pivotal moment that signaled to the world, inclusion matters. Education is not a privilege for some, but a right for all. Or think about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This wasn't just legislation, it was a victory of voices that refused to be silenced. It was a culmination of marches, sit-ins, and speeches that demanded equality and justice. It was a legal acknowledgement that everyone deserves a seat at the table, whether that table is a boardroom, a restaurant, or a voting booth. These historical moments aren't just stories of the past, they're mirrors. They force us to ask, what does exclusion look like today? Sure, we may not have separate water fountains anymore, but exclusion still exists. It exists when we make snap judgments about who belongs based on their appearance, their accent, their background. It exists when someone walks into a room and doesn't see anyone who looks like them. It exists when we ignore the voices of those who have been marginalized, whether it's in our workplaces, our schools, or even our churches. But here's the good news. Just as history teaches us about exclusion, it also inspires us with examples of inclusion. Think about the integrated worship services that emerged during the civil rights movement. In a time when the world was divided, there were churches that chose to unite. They didn't just preach love, they practiced it. They became living examples of what it means to offer everyone a seat at the table. And that's what Jesus was talking about in Luke chapter 14. His call to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind wasn't just about physical disabilities or financial status. It was a call to break down the walls that separate us, to challenge the systems that keep some people out, and to make room for everyone. The families behind Brown v. Board of Education didn't wait for the world to change on its own. The leaders who pursued or who pushed for the Civil Rights Act didn't sit back hoping someone else would speak up. They saw the injustice and they stepped in. So what about us? What barriers do we see in our own circles? Who's being excluded intentionally or unintentionally? And how can we follow the example of these heroes and ultimately the example of Jesus to make sure everyone feels included? Inclusion isn't just a historical movement or a social buzzword, it's a kingdom value. It's seeing people the way Jesus sees them, not as outsiders, not as less than, but as beloved children of God. Let's not just admire those stories of inclusion from history, let's live them. Let's look for the people who've been overlooked and make sure they know they belong. Because when we do, we're not just reflecting the courage of the past, we're reflecting the heart of God. And that's the kind of legacy worth living for. So what does it look like to extend the table in our lives today? The story Jesus tells in Luke chapter 14 isn't just a nice parable to reflect on. It's a call to action. It's a reminder that as followers of Jesus, our lives should reflect his radical hospitality. And here's the thing, extending the table isn't just about literally inviting people over for dinner, though that's certainly a great start. It's about creating spaces where people feel seen, valued, and included. It can be as easy as welcoming someone new. Maybe it's a person who just joined your church, your workplace, or your friend group. Do you remember what it feels like to be the new person? It's awkward. You're not sure where to sit, who to talk to, or even if you belong. I think about a story my dad told me about when he first became a Christian. He was excited to start this new chapter in his life, so he decided to visit a church. He walked in, sat down, and waited, unsure of what to expect. And you know what happened? Nobody said a word to him. Not one person introduced themselves or even acknowledged him. He stayed for the service, but the entire time he felt invisible. Afterward, he walked out without anyone stopping him, without anyone saying, "Hey, we're glad you're here." He told me that experience really stuck with him. It wasn't that he expected a parade or some big welcome committee, but a simple gesture. Just one person saying, "Hi, I'm glad you're here," could have made all the difference. It's hard to feel like you belong when it seems like nobody notices you're there. You never know what someone is walking in with. Maybe they're nervous, maybe they're struggling, or maybe they're just looking for a little bit of connection. A simple, "Hey, I'm glad you're here," can change everything for someone who feels out of place. It's a small act, but it's powerful. It has the ability to make someone feel like they belong, like they're valued, like they matter. And isn't that what we're called to do as followers of Jesus? To see people, to welcome them, to make them feel at home, not just in our churches, but in our lives. It doesn't take much, but it does take intentionality. And when we extend that kind of hospitality, we reflect the love of Christ in a tangible way. Welcoming someone isn't complicated, but it does require intentionality. It's about going out of your way to make someone feel included, even if it's uncomfortable or inconvenient for you. Maybe that means inviting the new coworker to lunch, introducing yourself to the person sitting alone at church, or striking up a conversation with someone who doesn't look like you. These small actions are powerful. They're moments where we extend the table and show someone they belong. But extending the table goes beyond just being friendly. It also means advocating for equal opportunities in our communities. This is where we take a deeper look at the systems and structures around us. Are they set up to truly include everyone, or are there barriers keeping certain people out? Think about your own community. Are there opportunities for everyone to succeed? Or are some people left behind because of their circumstances? Advocacy isn't just for politicians or activists. It's something we can all engage in. It might look like mentoring a student who doesn't have the same access to the same resources as others. It might mean volunteering at a local shelter or tutoring program. It might even mean using your voice to speak up when you see injustice happening. Another way we can extend the table is by sharing our resources and talents with those who are marginalized. This doesn't always mean writing a big check. It's about looking at what you already have and asking, how can I use this to serve others? Maybe you're great at graphic design. Can you offer your skills to a nonprofit that's doing good work in your community? Maybe you're an amazing cook. Could you prepare a meal for a family going through a tough time? Maybe you're good at listening. Could you be there for someone who needs to talk? Extending the table is about generosity, not just with our money, but with our time, our talents, and our attention. It's about being willing to share what we have, even when it's inconvenient, because we know that's exactly what Jesus calls us to do. Here's the thing. Extending the table doesn't always mean big, dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's the little, consistent acts of kindness that make the biggest difference. It's checking in on a friend who's been quiet lately. It's standing up for someone who's being excluded. It's inviting someone into your home, your circle, or your life, even if they're different from you. I think about the image of a table being set. When you extend a table, you don't just add more food, you add more chairs. You make room, you adjust, you say, hey, there's space here for you. And that's what God's kingdom looks like. It's not exclusive, it's expansive. Jesus didn't just teach about inclusion, he lived it. He dined with tax collectors, engaged with outcasts, and made it clear that everyone, regardless of their past, their status, or their struggles, was welcome at his table. If we're serious about following him, we're called to do the same. So, what could this look like for you? Maybe it's about stepping out of your comfort zone and talking to someone you'd normally overlook. Maybe it's about looking at your own circle and asking, who's missing? Who needs a seat at the table? Maybe it's about taking the resources you've been blessed with and using them to bless someone else. The point is, extending the table isn't just a one-time act, it's a lifestyle. It's a way of seeing the world through God's eyes, recognizing that every person we meet is someone he loves deeply and invites into his kingdom. And the beautiful thing is, when we extend the table to others, we get a glimpse at the heart of God. So as we think about what it means to extend the table today, remember this. It's not about perfection. It's about participation. It's about showing up, making room, and saying to the people around us, you belong here. Because when we extend the table, we're not just making space for others. We're reflecting the inclusive, transformative love of Jesus. And there's no better way to live than that. Take a moment to reflect on Jesus' words in Luke chapter 14. What if our lives weren't defined by who we exclude, but by who we embrace? What if the true measure of our faith wasn't about blending into the world's social systems, but about boldly breaking them down to make space for everyone at God's table? That's the radical, real, and relentless inclusivity Jesus calls us to. A life that reflects his love in who we welcome, who we make room for, and who we choose to truly see. Here's the thing, Jesus didn't just preach inclusion, he practiced it. His life was an open invitation to the marginalized, the overlooked, and the forgotten. calling them to come closer, to belong, and to be loved. And that's the heartbeat of the gospel. It's not a message reserved for the elite, the polished, or those who have earned a spot. It's for everyone, for me, for you, and for those the world easily ignores. Living this way is not easy. It's uncomfortable. It's inconvenient. And it pushes us out of our predictable patterns. Inclusion means stepping beyond the safe spaces of our comfort zones. It means tearing down the walls of judgment, assumptions, and fear of rejection. It means being intentional about creating spaces where people feel genuinely seen, valued, and loved. So how do we make this tangible in our daily lives? Maybe it looks like reaching out to the coworker who always eats alone. Maybe it's inviting a neighbor you've never spoken to. Maybe it's standing up for someone who's being marginalized, or offering your time, talent, or resources to someone who's struggling. These small, sincere gestures of hospitality are the starting point of change, the reflections of Christ's love that ripple outward. And let's not forget the lessons Black History Month teaches us about inclusion. It reminds us of the struggles fought for representation and the victories that push the boundaries of exclusion. From segregated churches to integrated worship spaces, these stories urge us to carry that same energy into our faith. Let's be people who don't just open the door, but build a bigger, stronger table. One set on the foundations of fairness, equity, and love. What would our world look like if we lived this way? Imagine our churches as spaces of true belonging, our workplaces as places of support, and our communities as beacons of love. Imagine what could happen if we stopped questioning who deserves a seat and start pulling out more chairs. Healing would happen. Unity would flourish. God's kingdom would be reflected on earth. And here's the bottom line. Jesus' love for us has no strings attached, and ours shouldn't either. He doesn't ask us to analyze who's worthy of love. He simply asks us to reflect his love in how we live, no conditions required. So let's do just that. Let's be the ones who extend the invitation, create the space, and live out a love so bold and so inclusive that it points people straight to him. The table of God's kingdom isn't limited. There's always room for one more. So today, let's ask ourselves, who can we welcome? Who can we make feel loved, seen, and included? When we choose to live with that kind of radical love, we're not just following Jesus, we're creating his kingdom one chair at a time. And that, my friends, is what it means to live through lenses of love.